I would like to welcome you all to this panel, which is Overworking Dinner, Creativity, Constraints and Capacity, Technology for Development. So we'll have 1 hour of discussions with us. Just to quickly introduce myself and to my colleagues on my right. So I'm Jaydeep Biswas. I'm the Senior Governance Advisor. I work for the UK International Department for International Development in the British High Commission here in Delhi. And I'll be moderating the discussions for you this evening. I'll quickly give the mic to my colleagues to introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is Savannah Kunovsky. I am a technologist and an educator. Currently, I am head of product at an organization called Affective Software. You will not find us on the internet anywhere because we are a 4-person stealth mode startup. We're in the education and mental health space. So we're looking at using proven mental health theories and methods that have been backed by research and science over the past 30 and 40 years, multiplying that, mixing it with modern technologies such as machine learning, and then making it more accessible to more people, just to have personalized mental health results. Before that, I have done a fair amount of work in technical education. So I was running a company in Nairobi for 2 years, and before that working in Silicon Valley for some time. I will be, sharing points around capacity building, especially from an education angle, from a technology angle, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts as well.
Hi, I am Koketso. I am a management consultant with AT Kearney, based out of the Johannesburg office. I spend quite a bit of my time doing work with governments. And tonight I will speak a little bit about our work on the 4th Industrial Revolution and how that really should be looked at when we are speaking about development, and how emerging markets can really look at their readiness and use that as a platform in order to propel themselves forward when we're talking about the topic of development.
Hi, my name is Max. As you can hear from my Austrian-German accent, I'm originally from Europe. I started my first e-commerce company out of university. I'm 22 years old. I have no idea what I'm going to enter to. After 22 months with 350 employees, and the company got acquired by Google. Why I'm saying this? Because I got a non-compete after this for 12 months to work for any transaction-based company, so I was essentially not able to work in Europe, and this embarked my journey to Southeast Asia. So I've started to invest in the first e-commerce companies in Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, and Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And now I'm running a digital transformation service provider. We've got clients such as Changi Airport, Qantas, Siemens, Tokyo Marine, and I consider myself being on the front line of digital transformation.
Thank you all. So you can see that such a rich panel is there. So I really would like to have conversation with you this evening. Usually the dinner and after dinner speeches are generally very entertaining, so I think we should keep it light, frothy, digital, tech, all of that. So we would really keep it in a flow. We'll make some opening interventions. Probably we'll, after 2 of us have spoken, we'll give a bit of a chance for you to come back, take 3 interventions, and then go for another, because I'm just changing the format a little bit, because I was told we'll have 2 hours, but now you'll be happy to know it's only 1 hour, so we'll try to wrap it in 1 hour. So help us with that. So we'd like to keep it in a real flowing sort of way. Let me start by giving you a bit of the context of the topic for the evening. Tech for development. Let me start with Take for Development in a sort of a movie setting in India, which is very popular in Bollywood. Take 4. So you do your takes and retakes in the movies. So we've had 4 stages of Take 4 for development in India. First was the industrial stage, which was 200 years till the 20th century. We missed that bus, right? So that was India, which missed the bus. Then we had another stage, which was Take 2, 1950 to 1990, when we sort of were isolated from the world, closed economy, we thought we'd do it ourselves, and that we made a mess of. Take 3, I think the stage goes from the 1990s, when we opened up to the world, liberalized, learned from the world a bit more. That's about last 28 years. You've seen some evidence of change, privatization, liberalization. The benefits have been percolating down, but not fast enough. And I think for tonight's theme, we are at take 4. The tech for development is stage 4. And a lot can be said about this new stage that India is getting into. A lot of the words have been bandied around artificial intelligence, augmented reality, propelling into the future, 4th industrial revolution, and all of that. So I want our panelists to talk about some of these in the real sense. And a colleague of mine I was talking to, I just flew in from London this morning, so pardon my incoherence a little bit, I'll allow the rest of the panelists to make up for it, was what would success look like in the context of tech for development in India. So I would really urge my panelists to also take a look at that, take that challenge, to give us a bit of a sense on what success would look like. What are the conditions of success? Are there enough of them in India? Is there a great opportunity of those drivers, of those conditions of success? You know, we are at a $2.5 trillion economy, projected to become $5 trillion economy in the next 7 years. That's quite realistic. We have tripled our per capita income in the last 15 years. Digital and tech economy is going to be $1 trillion of that. That's what the projections are. So huge opportunities, really. And how do we take some of that to benefit for all? Is the central question for the evening, I think. So I'll stop at that and probably start in a sequence for the first time. Go with you, Savannah, and then we can come. So your opening thoughts.
So I take most opportunities that I have on the stage to rant about education, so I will get there shortly. But I think that to start off talking about, what does success look like? It's interesting because in the design space, in the artificial intelligence space, and in a lot of the conversations that we've heard over the past day or so here, what these conversations have boiled down to is coming up with sort of a moral code and a value-based code of how we operate in this technology world that we currently have, and especially as that becomes more sophisticated as we have more and more advanced technology. So the reason why I want to bring this back to talking about success is just because success is really it's very dependent on the person that you're talking about the group that you're working with, about society that you come from, and it seems like it is on par with coming up with a code that works universally, if that's even possible. So I think that each ecosystem has to define what success means for itself. We have a lot of developmental goals that need to be factored in before we can have strong innovation in many places around the world, and that means that people are able to move away from the stress of day-to-day life, and able to even have the capacity to think about technology and to think about learning and to think about innovation. And I think that education has a good, it is the crux of all of this. So our moral code is, if I could answer the question of exactly what that looks like, I think that we would be in a really great place, but I can't. But I think that it needs to involve a democratized source of education that allows people to have a platform just to alleviate that stress. Education can come in many different forms. I think that it needs to stop being considered in the way that it traditionally has. It needs to be thought of in ways that are much more unconventional, as technology makes personalized education and online education much more available. people are able to sort of take what they need and apply, find the resources that they need in order to learn the concepts that they need in the ecosystem that they're living in, working in. I'll dive into much more of what that could potentially look like later, but I think that we're a group of people here that's sitting on a lot of potential in the work that we do, and defining what success means for each of us individually, defining what it means inside of the ecosystems that we work with, and making sure that we're really reaching around and understanding from the communities that we work with what success looks like, what that moral code should look like, will be a good foundation.
That's very quick, 2 interventions. I really want to get to the floor quickly to just check before I give it to Koketso. Do you think that's the kind of framing questions you would like, if there are 1 or 2 interjections you would like to make, or quick clarifications? I'm happy to open it up to 3 quick interventions, if that's what you like. Anyone?
Intervention from what?
On the kind of points we've just laid out, on the framework we are laying out for discussions, would you like to add anything, or we should proceed? We need more.
I think we need more.
Yeah, more trends, please. That's great. We can go there.
Sure thing. I would like to frame it in the context of where we have been before, so how development has happened in the past, what is going to happen going forward, and how specifically emerging markets can then position themselves in order to take advantage of specifically the 4th Industrial Revolution. So development has really followed the track of production, and that is around the industrial revolutions. First we had the steam engine, as you're all aware, and then came electricity. And by the time electricity came about is when we really understood the concept of mass production. But the implications of mass production meant that our laws then had to change in order to accommodate new businesses and new ways of doing things. Labor unions started to be formed, and skill sets needed to be changed in order to adapt them to those new economies. And that is where we saw countries like the UK, US, France, Germany really propel forward in their development, because they had to then change the way societies were working in order to meet the demands of this new economy that they started. By the time the 3rd Industrial Revolution came about, which is then the computing age, those economies that had already had that foundational start were then able to very quickly adapt and propel forward. Countries like China and South Korea were able then to take advantage of that computing age and use that as a basis to catch up on the development front. And that's really talking a little bit about what's happened in the past. Where we've landed to now is an age of the 4th Industrial Revolution. And effectively, and I'm sure Savannah and Max can talk a little bit more about this, far more than I know about these technologies. But you're in a situation where things like artificial intelligence, robotics, the Internet of Things, affective computing, I think Savannah can talk about that, has started to merge. And the implication of this is that we are now operating, or we will very soon operate in a world where services and products become different, and therefore skills in order to support those services and products are also different. So when we talk about the challenge of development, for me, the question that we really need to answer is, how do emerging markets, after starting off on a basis, you said earlier, Jaydeep, where you kind of missed the boat along the way, how do you then take that and take the advantages that technology can give you in order to leapfrog ahead for your development? Now, Kearney and the World Economic Forum did the study called the Readiness Assessment of the Future of Production. And what that did is that it looked at 2 things. First, it was the structure of production, which is looking at that legacy, that foundational legacy. What is the scale and the complexity of production currently in those countries that helps them set that foundational basis? But for me, more importantly, it looked at the drivers of production. And the drivers of production is, do we have an institutional framework that really supports new technologies in this 4th Industrial Revolution? Do we have a demand economy that is in place that we can sell to once we start to evolve in that way? Do we support innovation in technology? Do we have enough innovation in technology in these emerging markets in order to catch up in the first place? How are we dealing with human capacity in education? Do we have people in our countries that are skilled enough to be able to work in those economies, so that we don't get stuck in this place of being a low skill, low pay economies, which is exactly where we are now. And finally, which is also quite an important point around sustainable resources, we no longer operate as we did in the second industrial revolution. Sustainability is a big deal, and it's something that we have to consider going forward. In answering the question of what success looks like, for me, the intervention needs to, number one, understand the fact that there is a revolution that is happening, the fourth industrial revolution. And the scale and the speed of it is such that there has to be a coordinated response between many different factors. This is government, private sector, civil society, in order to really coherently deal with it in a way that will make an impact and move the needle. The second thing is really looking at it strategically. So we need to look at it more than just individually as countries, but how do we as regions, I mean the EU does a great job at this, regionally, how do you collaborate in order to position yourselves in a good way? And finally, it's about leveraging the current situations you're in. Africa, for example, would score really low from those foundational structures, the structures of production. But it also has been the thing that's propelled them forward, for an example being in the mobile money. So because we didn't have traditional banking systems, there's now a huge movement, particularly in East Africa, around using a cell phone, basically, as your bank. So for me, those are the questions that really we need to speak to talk to the success.
Thank you very much. I think we should down the line.
That's a very difficult task after Koketso spoke so well. So let me give a little bit of a private sector entrepreneur, early stage investor view. So we work with a lot of different industries for the digital transformation. And essentially, there's a model that the originally German government, but the Singaporean government has taken over. It's called the Smart Industry Readiness Index, with 16 dimensions, very technical. But in short, essentially what we see come to this, why I think it's so important for India to invest in, is we put it into 3 baskets. First is people, second is process, third is technology, and exactly in this order. I think what we see very often is that companies, they jump on technologies without having the right people in place and no process in place. Or they, if they're Germans, might have a perfect process, but the people are not trained on the technology. And I think what usually when we have a digital transformation work with an established company, we always see that they have not invested enough in their people. Because creating a process is easy. Deciding on a technology is even easier. But investing in your people takes time, effort. So alone in our group with more than 500 employees, vocational training is so intense, and we have to allocate minimum 20% of our time regularly just on training, so that our people can use new processes with the newest technology. So I think that's the first point I wanted to make. The second one, in terms of what does success look like, and I think you see this very well in emerging markets, especially in Southeast Asia, is local problems need local solutions. You see more and more that not the global big players are winning. You see that the local Gojek, the local Grab is winning against the global competition, because globally there might be an innovative app, but at the end of the day it's about distribution, and it's about the acceptance in the local market, and is it really solving a local problem? And so there are countless examples, but I think there's a massive opportunities for entrepreneurs in India, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, you name it, to really solve local problems with global knowledge, and to solve them in a local context. For example, we've got in Vietnam the largest marketplace with last mile logistics, and if I go to these guys and see what they have as a technical solution for second, third tier cities, I was blown away. Grab is 10 years, so Grab is Uber, just for the Southeast Asian market, is 10 years away from that. This is a local solution, and I was just blown away. And now, in an Indian context, so I'm a big believer, and I told you before, I got converted into believing in the Indian opportunity. But I think there's one caution I wanted to make. What can the government do? I think my perception is the Indian narrative is always how can we regulate it before something can be done. And I always say, you know, we as entrepreneurs, we are creators. The government, they are regulators. And I think what is needed is a sandbox and not a regulatory cage. Because by putting a cage in this province, here that province, you just slow down the development more. So I think if you can provide like a sandbox with incentives for this vocational training, I think like there are massive opportunities in the Indian market.
Fantastic. I think great set of inputs we've got on the focus on local problems, mass production structures, issues on education and skills. It will not be fair for me to ask the question, what does success look like, and not give a version of what I see before we open it up. Was my image of what does success look like. Max is a bit like the local taxi driver in Delhi that I've seen from the Uber ones. Very interesting, who have come from far-flung parts of India, and they are able to manage the navigation system with the touch phone technology helping, of course. But when I've spoken to them, they've said, very interestingly, just 3 hours of training they got, and then they're able to operate it. And I'm not able to operate it quite well, so I said, this is great, you can just do it. And they said, yes, we came, we heard about this opportunity in Delhi, and then we've been trained, and it has helped add my income. The mutual rating, again, something very interesting I found, makes them feel very empowered about their work, that they can rate the passengers as well. So very interesting how technology, as Max, you were saying, that technology is kind of driving the policy. I mean, the regulation is falling behind and trying to catch up, which may not be a bad thing at times, that regulation may be far too much in this country. But that's one of the images of success I have. I'm sure we'll get deeper into it. Are you ready for some thoughts, contributions, questions? I can see 1, 2, 3 hands in that sequence. You might first. Do you have a mic or?
No, should I talk loudly?
Yeah.
My name is Lena. I work on innovation, inclusive innovation, future work in India. I fourth industrial revolution, absolutely. I totally agree with what you said. But I think what makes emerging markets such as South Asia really interesting is that you have concurrently the second industrial, the third industrial, and the fourth industrial revolution. So if we're looking at inclusive development and the technological revolutions, how do we combine? What is success when we have these 3 revolutions happening? You go to a village in Jharkhand and we're looking at the second industrial revolution, and a last mile challenge and ecosystem. At that level, once you go to Mumbai and you have your fourth industrial revolution, you have a new fintech policy and the government is setting up regulatory sandboxes. So you have this gap. How do you look at the future of work in the fourth industrial revolution and development in this context? And it's not really something that we've seen Western governments or Western policymakers or Western consultants look at. So the frameworks we're using in emerging economies are based on studies that use frameworks originating from the US and the UK.
That's a great question. I thought that ladder of 1 to 4 all existing together. Should we take it or should we just take the top? Yeah? Let's take, you please. Would you like to?
Probably can talk loudly enough as well. Well, I'm not into making this gentleman move. I want to support Lena's point about the first through fourth existing here in India, and I would like to just add the fact that when we talk about the training needs, well, vocational training sounds very, middle-sized industry in Germany, or the failures of the international development community to introduce vocational and technical education back in the 70s and 80s, which was just a disaster. We're dealing with a country that is, India, has made remarkable progress in reducing poverty by the international measure, though there are arguments as it becomes a middle-income country, or richer middle-income country, whether the Indian number and the number that is used internationally actually are going to create a lot of people that will be even further left behind. And I don't think we can ignore, like as we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, which many consultants in advanced country governments are having trouble with, I think that India represents some challenges that I would love to hear about tonight. The other thing is, and on the plane here, I read, and I hope it will not be considered indiscreet if there are already people, I read The Garage, which is a story of extreme income inequality and political corruption and interference with the press, and even people getting put in jail for dealing with cricket matches, for trying to fix cricket matches. And it's remarkable that India is a country that offers all of this, but I didn't see the innovation piece in that story of what India is today, that one would, and which has a whole lot of stuff in it, that one would need to do something about in order to leverage India's democracy, to leverage that there are hundreds of millions of people who speak English, that there are an awful lot of things that India has to offer for its transformation. But I think putting the pieces together in a country where you've got the first and fourth all at the same time needs some thought. So perhaps we can move a millimeter or two on that this evening.
That's great. I think it's getting richer. Thanks for all your points, well noted, and we'll take it in the conversation. Can I get you there, please?
Thank you.
Do introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm from Sri Lanka. I work for the government as a civil service officer. I work for the Ministry of Digital Infrastructure, where the policies and strategies are oriented towards development kind of objectives. Actually, what I want to bring to this panel has been spoken by all three panels: education, skills development, and vocational training. So that is something I want to highlight even here. So as a country, Sri Lanka invested heavily on human infrastructure as well as physical infrastructure, mainly on education, pre-health, pre-education. So that led to certain kind of easy pudding when it comes to the digital revolution. We miss buses, as you mentioned, Jaydeep mentioned how India missed several buses on catching up technology and the markets and the innovation. So that now we think that we are on right track when catching up with the digital revolution. But the economics of scale, the numbers game. So we are a small country. The whole population is 21 million. So out of that, we don't produce much number of graduates from the state university system. So even that number is retaining within the country is a challenge. So keeping that talent within the country because the demand is so high out elsewhere. But there are tech geniuses in the country. So I was telling my colleague from Kearney that how Sri Lanka startup companies made the IT BPO industry as the third largest income earner within a very short span. We were based on the traditional income sources like tea and natural resources, then shifted into apparel and other industrial things. Now the private sector itself, there's a software development companies conglomerate called /Com. They are hard to make the IT industry number one in the income earning in the economy. So what I'm telling is that the government's role as a facilitator, somebody mentioned that the more you regulate, that there's more resistance and the people are leaving the country. So that's something I can see as not as a public servant, even as a general citizen of Sri Lanka. So the facilitation is the key to success. So you should facilitate innovation, facilitate the banking and the financial system, facilitating the infrastructure, and
please wrap up.
Yeah, keep the skills within your domain. So to create more value around that skills base. That's the key to success.
Sure. Thank you. Let me turn to my colleagues here in the panel. How would you like to take those?
Perhaps let me take the first one around the lattice net industrial revolution. So you spoke about how there's, even within one country, kind of a gap. Some people are still kind of the first and the others are maybe moving on to the fourth. And that's perfectly fine. You know, one of the things that the mobile money example is such a great one for is that you don't, what these technologies allow you to do is not necessarily immediately jump into the fourth industrial revolution, but they might also just enable you to participate better in other parts of your value chain. So the mobile money thing has now enabled subsistence farmers or local farmers to trade with each other in a safe manner. And the other thing I'd like to talk to is about country strategies. So one of the things we use the readiness index for is to really look at, go into countries and say, if you look at where you are and how you're trading with everybody around you, where everybody is going, where do you want to place yourself, given the trends going into the future? So, for example, South Africa is quite a big tourism market. Do we want to then focus for the next 10 to 15 years on growing tourism while we upskill at the same time and then meet the fourth industrial revolution at a later place? So all it really does is give governments an opportunity to really strategize. Then you've got a good understanding of where you are, where you need to invest, how much time it takes you to get there. And it also doesn't mean you necessarily have to develop in that traditional first, second, third, fourth perspective. You could go from second to fourth, depending on what your country strategy is, and making use of these technologies. So what it really is informing governments to be able to make these strategic choices for development.
Yes, so personally, I don't think it is as linear, as so simple to say, that's the first, the second, and the third one. So I see it more in a way that people IT or non-IT literate. To give you an example, I think someone in a small village in India who's doing mobile banking, he or she is more technologically advanced than my father, who went in Europe to university. So where is the first versus the fourth industrialization? I think it's more like a simplification or categorization, whereas I think here's like where the biggest opportunity lies in emerging markets. They overjump so many steps. They jump on the latest technology because of the necessity of having like no bank branches. They have to use something like mobile banking, or they have to do like micro lending online. I think there's like a massive technological opportunity. And I think this thinking, as it was called, like from the West, I mean, it's so outdated. So if we look for innovation, we look into the rural area of Indonesia. We look into China and the third tier cities, because like there's where the real innovations happens, and not like the thinking in terms of what has worked like in Europe or US has to work in other markets. So I think this is not only in policy, so it's also like in the private enterprises. So, which brings me to the point of the numbers game. I don't think it's a numbers game. Also, Sri Lanka can be a small market, but if you have a look at Israel, look how small it is. Super innovative. They don't think in Israel as a market. They think it's a global market. And I invested in anything that got acquired by Axiata in Sri Lanka. And what I loved about the CEO, he said, "My competition is Amazon in the US. My competition is not my Sri Lankan partner." And I think just don't think in geographical borders, but more in terms of your market is the global market, and make a difference. And lastly, role of government versus private, the question from the training. So personally, how I see this, that where the government failed to produce a proper education for the workers in the 21st centuries, private companies are forced somehow to step in. To give you an example, in Malaysia, we hired people literally from the street. For example, one Uber driver, he's now one of our best specialists. But the point is, we had to provide free training for them in cooperation with Google, in cooperation with Facebook, because like they were not trained the way how they were supposed to be trained out of school. So I think this is something that we should really think of, that there's a massive opportunity that someone in a small rural village can do an online Harvard course and educate him or herself because out of the interest. So I think there's a massive, not only opportunity, but also a massive switch that's happening. And I think we should be prepared for it, and we should have like policy incentives. Like in Singapore, the Skills Future for especially people above 50, that they get grants to do IT training, so that they get IT literate. I think great initiative, and I think we have to think like in these terms. Yes, it's my.
So, a couple of points that are in very different directions. First off is that education needs to have more accountability. One of the big reasons why a lot of these current education systems, past education systems, fail is because their outcomes, their results are not really tied to the real world. So you have these gaps between what people are learning in schools and what they actually need to know in the real world. And that accountability needs to be a part of the business model of education, because higher education especially is a business. Something that you pay for, and it's something that should serve you in your life and in your career. Next point is around state capacity for these types of initiatives. It's piggybacking off of what you were saying. You can't always just rely on your state to provide high quality education, to provide services, just because there is not enough capacity in most governments to work on those initiatives. Funding is placed in different areas, and if our current needs are more basic than providing high skill AI training to the general population, then we have to make decisions about where we expend resources. And so I do think that the private sector is really important in providing more education and providing it through technology, because that it's a democratizing platform for education. Education should not be something that's tied up in a university. It shouldn't be tied up that only the kids that get into Harvard get to hear the Harvard lectures. Those are things that are becoming more and more accessible for more people. And the role of education and the role of schools should be to deliver that really world-class curriculum, but not necessarily in the old education model or in the current education model. You don't need a teacher to be standing up and teaching you in order to have a great education, when you can have the best professor who's both a great lecturer and also has the right information, streaming a video, and then have your teacher as a mentor or guide or support system. And a lot of this can be done through peer learning, peer education, working together in teams and groups, and it really takes the reliance off of teachers who are tired and overworked and have a life outside of their teaching job as well. Last point is just around cultural mindset towards innovation and technology. I think that in building capacity for technology, it is important to include in these digital literacy programs, regardless of what level they're at. If it's here's your first computer versus here's how to program something in a machine learning environment. There has to be an extra amount of consciousness that is built around why this technology is important and how it serves you. So it's not enough to just know how to run a machine learning algorithm or how to use a computer. It is, how does this apply to me in my everyday life? How does it improve my work? How can I use it as really a critical thinking tool to better my business, to better my family, to just get to the grocery store more effectively.
Great points. I think they are intersecting in various sort of ways. One thing to note, I just was noting that data, and Savannah, your point about education, and education as a public good, how they sort of intersect. One thing to note, I just was looking, data in India currently costs about 1/50th for say 1 GB of data in UK, the comparison that I know well of. Now the question is, with that kind of cheap data available in India, would that lead to better video streaming if somebody was providing a public good of some good skills and training? And here I also want to introduce one factor that we're talking about the role of the state and some foundational factors. Mind you, if there's no power or electricity, then a lot of this will not work actually. in a state in Uttar Pradesh, in India, where you have power cuts still significantly, to that hour, 10 to 12 hour power cuts. So I'm just sort of slightly pointing to the basics that some of this will still require foundational work, without which the advantage of the fourth industrial revolution will be lost. So that's just one point. But I think that your numbers point will come back to, I do want to touch upon, 83% of India actually still living under $5.5 a day, which is not really the international poverty line, but really a living wage. And we've got literally 1 billion people under $5.5 a day. So that's quite a scale of challenge, but we can pick it up later. Are you ready for another set of conversations, reflections from the floor? 1, 2, and 3. That's great. So I'll come to you. Please do introduce yourself. I think there's a mic on the floor somewhere.
My name is Jaydeep. I'm from Cameroon. And after listening, I just wonder if there should not be enough funding for imagination, because we have to move from the concept of work, economy, growth, seeing all what AI and ICT is bringing. Because when I go through the statistics, for example, all the textile sector, which is employing almost all the women who are working in industry, are going to be wiped away, and many other sectors like that. Don't you think that it's time to fund imagination, to start looking another kind of world? Because what is work without work? That's the question a friend asked me today. Thank you.
That was actually my point. I wanted to point out that the fourth industrial revolution maybe not only, that was actually my point that you already raised. I just wanted to say that maybe the technological developments in the fourth industrial revolution does not only come with opportunities, but also with great challenges in terms of future of work. And I had a rather pessimistic view, but I think the way you framed it, thinking positive, thinking about how can we reimagine the world, is actually a better way of asking the question. So thank you.
Hello. Hi, I'm CyFy. I'm from ORF. I was coming back to what you've highlighted in your brief here, where you were talking about the discussion is all about government identifying technologies and how the capacity should be developed. I think, like you said, if we look at the basics, where at least India is concerned, I deal with urban issues and governance issues. So where India is concerned, the basic problem is when we are even planning for the technologies, we do not have the data which is updated. Like today, when we are planning for mobility, AI in mobility or digital transformation in mobility or in any other any other of these categories, the data we are referring to is the 2005 data. And if we are going to plan according to a 2005 data, it is right. So for our 2005 data, how are we going to really be addressing the challenges that lay forward? Then we are really not planning for the future. We are probably planning for what happened 10 years before. And the other thing is, another thing that I've seen is like typically with India and probably some other countries which are in a similar growth path, we are very reactive in nature. So right now you see that the buzzword is AI. So all the state governments are just scrambling around to look for anyone who's working in AI and just taking them on board without thinking of whether the technology is really important for them, whether this is something they need, nothing of that sort. And suddenly we are having all the governments announcing AI technology centers and skilling schools, and suddenly they're going to be full of people who are going to be learning AI and many other new technologies. And by the time they are out, we might be in the 5th industrial revolution. So my whole point is that how are we really looking at the problem in the right way? I mean, it should start from the basics, and then every other time we go back to the drawing board. I don't know if it's the same with other countries like ours, but in India, this is definitely the way it is going. And so even if we discuss all these big things here, what is actually happening behind is that just because you're a country who wants to be there, you will take anything that comes your way and go ahead with it. Is that the way to look at things? I'm not sure.
Thank you. I think we can take a couple more. Yes, perfect. So, please.
Hello everyone, I'm Dikelevi. I come from South Africa, but I live and work in Lesotho. The question that I have is, we live in a global, society now, and a lot of the challenges that we face in our societies are the same in, different countries. And the same challenge of having, the same challenge that you have in India of having one part of the society living in, one industrial revolution and having another living in another industrial revolution also exists globally. So in Lesotho, for example, we're not even talking about the 4th industrial revolution. We're still trying to figure out other problems, other basic problems. My question is around how do we start thinking globally about the impact of having other nations so advanced while others are still grappling with basic issues. What challenges does that pose, and how are we thinking about as a global economy? Because a challenge in Lesotho will definitely affect India, regardless of how advanced India becomes in its digitization.
So my name is Halila Kelvin-Boy, and I live and work in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, the land of the Kilimanjaro. So just two things. Last week I was at I was in a space where we were having a conversation about science and technology and how that relates to development in Africa, whether it poses a great opportunity or a great threat. And the conversation was split into two schools of thought. Well, there's that World Economic Forum report that came out that outlined the declining jobs, the top 10 declining jobs and top 10 emerging jobs as per 2022. I'm not sure if any of you saw it. And what that report says is by 2022, Africa will have, if we kind of engage with kind of where they propose we should go, we should be able to create about 53 million jobs. However, 53 million jobs come 2050. Now, Tanzania alone, and that's a collective number for the whole continent, Tanzania alone needs to generate 800,000 jobs a year to kind of grapple with the immense demand when it comes to youth employment. And I look at the 53 million jobs come 20 whatever, and it sounds great the first time that they say it, but when you do the math, it's kind of frightening because it does not necessarily relate to the actual demand. So going to the question that was asked before, are we really creating a monster that we're not really taking a deep look into, or are we really creating opportunities? And then secondly, when it comes to, I like what, I do not remember your name, but the gentleman on your panel. I can't see that far. Yes, but then you mentioned that innovation really comes from the grassroots. I mean, communities that are, you find real innovations in spaces with people with need. You just spoke about Indonesia. We have a lot of innovations coming out of emerging markets. However, one of the things that there's a threat that's coming out where we have a lot of partners who are basically giants in the developed spaces coming into the emerging markets and posing as development partners because they have seen an opportunity for, their own economic advancement in the innovation of the eager but unknowing youths who are innovating in the emerging markets. And for example, I was privy to knowledge about a development partner who came in to East Africa, and what they were doing was creating a challenge where they were offering $10,000 grants for some of the top 10 innovations in the challenge that people had to apply, and what they said is in the fine print that all the intellectual property rights to those innovations would inevitably be owned by them. Now, they got applications, and you find that there's a lot of these youth who are eager, and they are hungry for the funding, and they look at these development partners as somebody who understands and somebody who cares. But at the end of the day, this is a giant that's coming up to swallow your livelihood because you do not know. So then, in the case of capacity building, what kind of capacity are we really building? What are we teaching them, and how do we really prepare them to kind of grapple with the realities of the development?
Thank you very much. It's like a great conversation going. I think we've got about 15 minutes. We'll try and sort of get into sort of final round of discussions. But there's a lot there, at least what I heard, innovation, affordability, accessibility. There's one thing I want to sort of draw this towards, drawing from a lot of your inputs. It's one of the key questions that has been posed in the session, which I didn't take upon at the start, was does affordable ICT, which is accessible, makes development outcomes effective? Now, from what all we've been conversing, and that's almost like an oxymoron, that if you have affordable ICT, and if it is accessible, which is what all of you are saying, this inequality point, that it will be developmentally outcome focused. But the question is, how do you make it affordable? How do you reduce the inequality of the ladder of 4 industrial revolutions that you talked about? So I think if I can turn to my colleague Savannah, maybe this time, starting with you first, give us a bit of a sense of some of the questions asked, if you would like to tackle any of them in particular, but also to keep the conversation flowing. So pick up a few and would like to answer as well in respect. Is that okay? Start with you.
It's like a pop quiz. Sure, I'm ready. Okay, so I think that on one hand, a lot of what we're talking about, talking about funding imagination, talking about the need for the digital divide to be lessened and equalized, and how to approach that. I think that it's a really interesting space, because when we look at where funding is coming from, there are all of these parameters around what type of return funders are looking for, and most of those are with this mindset of I want money back, I want social capital, I want mostly more money, rather than understanding the developmental the development goals that are being targeted, and the social change that's happening. So I think that a lot of the time the money is coming into the developing world from external sources, and that's a mindset. And ideally, there can be more structure internally inside of emerging economies to fund and work with innovation, so that they understand the context that they're working with, and can be taking into consideration more than only that return. Although I think that sustainable businesses are really important. On top of that, everywhere in the world, whether we're looking at Silicon Valley or or elsewhere, everywhere is a test bed for new ideas, and everyone is an innovator. If you really want to be, And so I think that that needs to be continuously cultivated in society as a mindset of how do I solve this problem more effectively, and just having that sort of as a tool, a continuous tool to be used behind this fund for imagination. Another interesting point, which I think is from Kel's questions here, is that there's a role that I think that the government in regulation has played in watching technology and watching this continuous innovation ecosystem kind of just go off the rails. It's sort of been this balancing force of saying, you've gone too far, and here's structure around how innovation can happen in a healthy way. So I think that that's one thing that can sort of keep tech on the rails. But another big piece of it is being a user or not being a user, and sort of thinking about your use of technology or your sharing of technology as a way of voting in the tech ecosystem. Because as a user, if you're using something continuously, you're voting for that product. You're saying, I like this, I want more of it. And that's a really powerful thing. So no users means, companies not going to do so well.
Okay, I'm going to try to attempt to answer a few of the questions at the same time. Somebody talked about funding for imagination. When we look at companies like Germany and France, the UK, a lot of what's going on in North America. Quite a few of them have programs around funding for the fourth industrial revolution. Now, a few things that are consistent in these programs is that, number one, there is a lot of funding around innovation and technology. Number two, there is a push for creating new business models and startups in these industries, or in the fourth industrial revolution. And the third thing about these programs is that there are partnerships between government, private sector, academia, and civil society. Now, to answer your question, I think emerging markets, Africa specifically and LATAM, really have a choice here. We are in a situation where we could either suffer from the effects of fourth industrial revolution or take advantage of it. And for us to be able to do that, we need to respond in some sort of way. And that way does not necessarily mean we do it in the same way that European and North American countries have been able to do, because we don't necessarily have the same access that they do. But there are some things that we do have as an advantage. For one, we have a demographic dynamic in Africa. So you were talking about we need to create 800 jobs within a certain amount of time, but we also have one of the youngest populations, and a young population that will then become a market at some point. So it's in everyone's best interest for that population to be in a position where it creates a market, because a market will create opportunities. The other advantage that we have in Africa specifically, but also in other emerging markets, is while we looked at the structures of production and talked about the scale, the complexity of current production as a platform for her to move forward, it also sometimes becomes a challenge, because you're sitting then with legacy systems and legacy infrastructure, and that problem we don't necessarily have then in Africa and in Latin America right now. So the question then is, how do we bring together governments, how do we bring together private sector companies and civil society to create that innovation around those industries where we don't have the barriers that other countries do? You also mentioned the issue of IP, which I'll talk about in a general regulation sense, and that this is exactly the reason why we need strong support from governments and civil society organizations to be able to look at what is coming in and out of our countries, and how do we protect some of that IP and some of that work that is happening. So for me, it's really about, when we want to scale this for real development, it needs to be a coordinated and strategic effort that comes from a multifaceted stakeholders that really participate in this thing. And lastly, I want to touch on the future of work. I did see that WEF report, and I think Samir said there's another one coming out at the end of the week. Three main things for me that come up from a future of work perspective is, if we want to participate, if we want to be part of this new wave, and even skill ourselves up to even properly be part of the second industrial revolution, we are going to have to look at analytical skills. We're going to have to look at how do we problem solve, but we're also going to have to look at how do we engage in a way that, or how do we differentiate ourselves from what, for example, robotics can do, and that's where things like creativity and empathy come into play. And for all of that, again, to be possible, we need to be able to operate in such a way where we have an understanding of the technologies that we're using, we understand what it is we want to use them for, and we've created an environment through our governments, our civil society, our private sector, that enables us to do all of that. But for me, we are at a crossroads. We either take advantage of, or become, or we will get taken advantage of by this new trend. And it's really how we strategize around that that's important.
Okay, let me also touch on the questions first from a friend from Cameroon. Fund imagination, work without work. Essentially now we work for money, and I see it as a massive opportunity. So I don't have the European pessimistic, tech will take away our jobs. I see it more, it will give us a lot of free time. We don't have to do stupid, monotonous things that can be automated. But I think it will bring a lot of other questions, and more societal questions. What are we doing with so much free time? If people, just know for myself, if I have too much free time, I do stupid things. So that's why I try to keep myself always occupied and do things. So I think this will be a massive societal question that we have to ask ourselves. If from one day to another you don't have to work anymore, what are you doing? So I think a big question mark. Then I also want to talk a little bit about technology in the Indian context from our friend from ORF. Unfortunately, I have to provide the hard truth is we are far away from AI as it is in the media, because you have to essentially separate between narrow AI and general AI. And the media never differentiates between. Narrow AI means you've got one problem and it got solved through AI. This is where we are already. But general AI, where any application cannot only solve this specific problem, but 10 other unrelated problems, we are decades away. The pioneers of AI, machine learning from MIT, they also say, they are studying this since 60 years. It will not happen tomorrow. So unfortunately, I have to be the boomer in here. It will not happen as soon as we expect it to be. But in terms of the question for the globally, what if other nations are so advanced? And I want to come back to this. Local problems need local solution. It's great that the US is so advanced. It's great that you've got Amazon Prime and you get it delivered in a day. But if you live in Vietnam and Dong Nai, it takes 60 days that you get something delivered from Amazon. That's not a solution. You should rather piggyback on this, that you say, okay, you get it shipped with Amazon to Singapore, but then you organize it within 4 to 6 days to this province in Dong Nai, which is a 10x improvement. So this is where the real opportunity lies. Again, local problems need local solutions. And then to my genetic Tanzanian friend, who says the giants in the space, aka the US, big players, to name them. I think the challenge is that the government can and should provide an environment for innovations and that people can prosper, in the best case scenario. But I think what you've highlighted here is where the government failed to provide incentives and or a platform that people can do this. That's why private enterprises went in and they want to own the IP. So I think what the government really has to do is support local success stories, build up on these, co-invest in these ones. And I think, again, you see Gojek, super promoted by the Indonesian government. Grab, it is a Singapore story, but if you know the history, it's a Malaysian company started out of Malaysia, but Singapore said, hey, please put a headquarter here, we want to make this a local story, and now it's a Singapore-based success story. So I think it's so important that the government supports local entrepreneurs, local success stories, and that helps, you know, to breed the next generation and the following generation. Then you don't have the case that your Google comes with the Chromebook, it's for free, but technically all the IP stays with us. So this might be a possible solution like for Tanzania.
Thank you, Max. Thank you both, Savannah and Koketso. I think we are at the end of the conversation. I'll give you a last word, but just to say that this is a session which is drawing to a close. Any last words from first three? So you have? Really, in a couple of minutes, please.
Yes, very fast. I think the fourth or industrial revolution or any other revolution can bring change if socially, philosophically, there are changes. Because like tractor, for example, was created by engineers long ago. But when you go to Africa, women are still hoeing. Why the tractor is not so expensive. One tractor in one day can, cultivate the whole city of Delhi, but is not used. So I think there should be space to rethink the system, because there have been revolution, there have been technology, if those technology were used for the benefit of the human being, I think we would have been far, far more ahead. And coming to the research that are being done in Europe and all sorts of things, we have to be careful. The kind of research I'm coming through is like, for example, micro-insurance, the possibility for markets. How can we go and get market in Africa? How can we go? Those kind of, in terms of social research, I said that's not the way to go, because we are going to exhaust those areas. So I think we have to rethink the society, to look into it with the objective that to put the human at the center, not the human as an object. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that would be a nice point to close on, to rethink, recenter on the human. My 3 takeaways for the session, I would like to summarize. It's a great conversation, very rich. Is more free time. I think that's a great one to take away from. I didn't realize this session would produce such a great outcome. So that's really optimistic. Funding, reimagination. It's a great one. And Max, you give us reassurance that artificial intelligence is not going to take over in a few decades, so we'll have to rely on our actual intelligence, which is also a great reassuring thought. With that, I would like to thank my panelists. It has been fantastic. At the floor, thank you very much.